The knock came at the front door of Westbury Hall at 20 minutes past 6 on the cold, pale blue Norfolk morning of Tuesday the 28th of April, 1818. And it was so unexpected that the underfootman in the back kitchen, polishing the boot-blacking pan in the half-dark, dropped his cloth into the basin and said one short word he should not have said in the hearing of the cook. The cook set down her wooden spoon, looked at the boy over the rim of her spectacles, and said only, "Get along to Mr. Jepson, lad." The boy went, with his ears pink. Mr. Jepson came through the green baize door at a measured pace. He was 60 years of age, silver-haired, dignified, dressed at this hour in his second-best black, the buttons not yet quite all done up. He listened to the underfootman's stammered report with the unsurprised gravity of a man who had been a butler at Westbury Hall for 31 years. He bid the boy fetch Mrs. Proctor at once. He himself proceeded across the great hall to the front door, drew back the heavy iron bolt, turned the key, and drew the door open. Mrs. Winifred Proctor came down the back passage at a brisker pace than her years would have suggested. Fastening the small jet cross at her throat as she came, she was 58, silver-grey hair tucked already under a clean white linen cap, warm, pale blue eyes, fair Norfolk weathered skin, gently lined, a kind round face, and a soft mouth, medium of stature at 5'4", slim and brisk in plain black bombazine and a white linen apron. She had been Lady Rosamond's governess from 1809 to 1815, and her companion since. Upon the step, in the cold, pale blue light of a morning that had not yet quite let go of dawn, stood a tall, lean, broad-shouldered man of 31, mud-spattered to the knee from the 8 days' ride out of Lincolnshire. He wore a dark grey-caped travelling greatcoat, heavy serge with 3 short capes at the shoulder, the lower hem bearing the honest marks of a Norfolk lane, over buff buckskin breeches and mud-spattered black top boots. Beneath the greatcoat, she could see a dark blue undress travelling tailcoat and a white cravat hastily tied at the King's Head at Swaffham. He carried a plain, dark brown beaver hat in his right hand. A plain leather riding glove was upon his left. Upon the same hand glinted the heavy silver of the Tarrington ducal signet, its small azure crest a stag's head, the ring she had last seen across a dinner table at Tarrington Court in August 1817. His thick, dark russet-brown hair, deep warm brown with russet lights even in this cold light, was cut close at the nape and just brushed his collar, with one wave of it fallen across the brow. There was the faintest silver only at the right temple and a small dark mole at the left, long-standing, not a wound. His face was strong and angular. High cheekbones, straight Roman nose, firm grave mouth that did not now smile, strong clean-edged jaw with a faint shadow upon it, his eyes in a fair faintly weathered face, were the most arresting thing about him. Clear, deep grey-green, true hazel-tipped, thick, dark lashes, a steady considering gaze fixed upon Mr. Jepson with the peculiar gravity of a man who had not yet decided whether the worst of his journey was the 8 days behind him or the 11 minutes still to come. Mrs. Proctor knew him at once. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied deeply in the small, clean fashion she had taught Rosamond herself. "You are very welcome at Westbury. Mr. Jepson, His Grace the Duke of Tarrington. Pray, sir, will you come within? The east drawing-room has a fire in 5 minutes." And she had, by then, and without any visible alteration of her gentle Norfolk countenance, taken in the mud upon the boots, the cravat tied without a glass, the hat held in the right hand rather than the left, and the absence of a carriage upon the gravel sweep, and had drawn from these the 4 conclusions that any sensible woman of 58 would draw, none of which she would name aloud to anyone before noon. He inclined his head. "Mrs. Proctor, I am obliged." His voice was a deep, clear, quiet baritone, plain and unhurried, the voice of a Lincolnshire horseman who had not been required, in the course of his life, to raise it. She admitted him into the small east drawing-room, where the cold, pale blue April light came in at the long sash window across the lime walk. The under-housemaid had lit the coals and drawn back the curtain. Mrs. Proctor caused tea to be brought. She sent Mr. Jepson up the great staircase to wake Lord Westbury, and the upstairs maid up the back stair to wake Lady Rosamond, with the message that his Grace of Tarrington was below upon a matter of immediate business. She herself sat with the Duke for the 11 minutes that it took the family to descend. He did not sit. He stood at the window, the dark grey caped greatcoat shed into Mr. Jepson's careful hands, the beaver hat set quietly upon the small marble table in the hall. He had refused tea. He looked out at the lime walk where the cold, pale blue April morning was slowly gathering the strength to become a day. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with what is not there. And there are, rarer, harder, more dignified, stories that begin with a single sharp knock at 20 minutes past 6 on a cold, pale blue Norfolk morning, when a 31-year-old Duke, who has spent 8 days riding north from Lincolnshire to do the right thing, arrives at the front door of a girl he has not been able to release in his own conscience, and waits in a small east drawing-room for her father to come down. To understand why he was at that door, one had to go back 3 years and a half, to the disaster of October 1814. That month, at Newmarket and at Brooks's in St. James's, Lord Lionel Westbury, 6th Earl of Westbury, had lost in the space of 12 days and across a dozen wagers, a wiser man would not have entered, the sum of £80,000. The Westbury entail of 3 centuries was at the end of that month no longer a private trouble, but a near public ruin. Westbury Hall, the Norfolk estate of 4,000 acres, the village of Westbury Magna, and the parish of St. Andrews were to fall. The man who would not allow them to fall was the late 4th Duke of Tarrington. 64, dying of dropsy at his Lincolnshire seat, an old college friend of Lord Westbury's father, a man with a single son and heir, and a quiet horror of seeing an old name extinguished by a soft man's bad evening. In November 1814, he paid the 80,000. The instrument by which he paid it was a deed of marriage, drawn up by Mr. Elwood Greenway of Lincoln's Inn, and signed in the Tarrington Library by the dying Duke, by Lord Westbury, by Lord Westbury's only daughter, Lady Rosamond Westbury, then 16, and by the Duke's only son and heir, Lord Gideon Tarrington, then 27. The deed bound the young people in marriage at Lady Rosamond's majority of 20 in the spring of 1818. 3.5 years' grace, given for the girl to have a childhood and the man his proper grief. For Lord Gideon Tarrington had, at the time of the deed, been engaged for 7 months to Lady Ophelia Ayres, who was at that moment dying at Bath of consumption. She had died there in December of 1814, 6 weeks after the signing. The 4th Duke followed her in September of the year after at Tarrington Court, and Gideon, the new 5th Duke, at 28, inherited the dukedom, the £80,000 debit, which Mr. Greenway quietly absorbed through the rents of 3 good Lincolnshire harvests, and a deed of marriage to a girl he had met 4 times in his life. He performed his obligations under the deed as a man of his nature could only perform them. Honourably, he wrote to Lord and Lady Westbury twice each year, in March and in October, in plain courteous lines that always asked after Rosamond by name. He invited the Westburys to Tarrington Court for 3 summers, 1815, 1816, 1817, in which Rosamond walked his deer park, sat at his table, read in his library, and learned his country, his Latin, his tenant rents, his Lincolnshire boundary disputes, and his private opinion of Mr. Coleridge. He sent her at Christmas a small parcel of books each year, with a list, in his clear, unhurried hand, of further reading for the spring. He paid one short formal call at Westbury Hall in October of 1816. He did not press the matter, but in the 4 winters between, he had become slowly and exactly aware of 2 truths. The first was that the deed had been signed by a 16-year-old who had been told, in plain words, that the alternative to her signature was the loss of her family's home. The second was that he had, in the years since, allowed himself to come to like, quite genuinely, quite honourably, the company of a young woman who had not at 16 been free to refuse his. By the cold, pale blue April of 1818, with the wedding fixed for Tuesday, the 12th of May, at the parish church of Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, his conscience had, in the plainest language, refused. He had decided to release her. He had ridden alone from Tarrington Court on the dull grey Monday of the 20th of April, slept 8 nights in 8 different inns along the slow road across Lincolnshire, the Fens and the Norfolk borders, slept on the 8th at the King's Head in Swaffham, and risen in the dark at 4 to ride the last 12 miles to Westbury before any servant should be obliged to call him a guest. He had come to the front door because the front door was the only door at which he could honourably knock. At 6:30, mister. Jepson reappeared at the drawing-room door, gave one small dignified bow, and said that Lord Westbury would be obliged to receive his Grace in the small library. Gideon bowed to Mrs. Proctor and crossed the great hall. In the small library, the curtains had been drawn back upon the cold, pale blue morning. A coal fire was lit. Lord Westbury stood at the chimney-piece in the dark blue morning coat, with worn gilt buttons hastily put on, the dove-grey waistcoat, the buff pantaloons creased from the press, a man of 51 looking older than his years, slumped, sallow, his small grey eyes already braced for a thing he could not yet name. He inclined his head. "Your Grace." Gideon did not sit. He spoke for 9 minutes, plainly without ornament, without the smallest tremor of self-pity. He had not come, he said, to require anything of Lord Westbury or of his daughter. He had come to release Rosamond from the deed of November 1814. He proposed to acknowledge in writing, through Mr. Greenway, that the £80,000 his late father had paid had been, in conscience and in fact, a free gift, with no expectation of any consideration from the Westbury family in any year hereafter. The Westbury entail was secure. He asked only that the matter be communicated to Lady Rosamond herself this morning, in his presence, in the small east drawing-room, with Mrs. Proctor present as her elder. He stopped speaking. The coals ticked once in the grate. Lord Westbury took a long, careful breath. He looked at the row of his own grandfathers above the chimney-piece. He drew one sharp, short breath, as a man does when a great quiet weight is taken from a shoulder he has not been able to set down for 42 months. "Your Grace," he said at length, his voice not entirely steady, "I have not deserved this, and my daughter has not deserved her 4 years of preparing for it. We shall proceed as you propose." It was 20 minutes to 7. At 7 the 4 of them met in the small east drawing-room. The cold, pale blue April morning sun had just come over the lime-walk hedge and lay in a long, pale rectangle upon the boards by the window. The coal fire had been built up. A fresh tea service stood ready. Gideon stood at the chimney-piece. He had accepted the under-footman's 12-minute work upon his black hessians. The boots now stood polished upon the boards. He wore the dark blue undress, travelling tailcoat, the white cravat, a dove-grey silk waistcoat, charcoal pantaloons. The Tarrington ducal signet was upon his right hand. He did not sit. Lord Westbury sat in the small striped chair by the fire, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes upon the carpet between his shoes. Mrs. Proctor stood by the door, her hands quiet at the front of her apron, her warm, pale blue eyes upon the young woman who had just come down. Lady Rosamond Westbury, 20 years of age, walked into the small east drawing-room as a young woman who had been hastily dressed and who did not propose to apologize for it. Her long, rich, strawberry blonde hair, warm gold with the definite copper rose lights that the morning would, in another half-hour, find, had been pinned in a smooth low chignon at the nape, with small wisps at the temples that the maid had not had time to straighten. Her clear, sea-grey eyes were thick-lashed, very steady, the cool grey with the hint of blue-green that her mother had given her, the colour of the North Sea in October. Her skin was ivory fair, with a faint, warm rose flush across the cheekbones. A few faint freckles across the bridge of her straight, small tip-up nose, and a small natural beauty mark beside the left corner of her soft, well-shaped mouth. Her finely arched, dark honey-brown brows were level. Her gentle but firm jaw was level too. Her long, graceful neck rose out of the white lawn fichu at the throat of a plain, high-waisted, navy blue wool morning gown, long-sleeved, high round neck, hastily pinned over plain black wool stockings and plain black leather slippers. A small silver locket on a black silk cord lay at her collar. She was slender, 5'5", and her carriage was upright in the manner of a young woman who had been taught very deliberately for 4 years. She crossed the drawing-room to the small striped sofa between the window and the fire. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. Her clear, sea-grey eyes settled upon Gideon and did not move. He addressed her directly, with the gravity he had brought with him from Lincolnshire, without a single glance towards her father or towards Mrs. Proctor at the door. "Lady Rosamond, I came to Norfolk this week to do you the only honour my conscience would permit. I release you from the deed of November 1814. The £80,000 my father paid in that month was a free gift, never a purchase price. The Westbury entail is safe regardless of what passes in this room. I have spent 4 years preparing to marry a young woman who at 16 was not free to refuse me, and I find, at 31, that I cannot in honour proceed. You are at your own disposal, today and hereafter. The wedding fixed for the 12th of May is, in this hour, withdrawn. I have come this morning, before any banns are read or wedding clothes finally fitted, to set you free of any obligation you had not at 16 been free to refuse. I shall, if you wish, leave this house at 8:30 without further conversation. I shall, if you wish, remain to receive your reproach. I shall, if you wish, remain to receive your silence." He did not sit when he had finished. He stood. She did not look at her father. She did not look at Mrs. Proctor. She let the small silence settle upon the carpet for the length of one slow breath. She lifted her chin by precisely 1/4 of an inch. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice was a soft, warm contralto, educated, with a faint Norfolk borders softening upon certain vowels, the voice of a young woman who had not raised it in her life and did not propose to raise it now. "I thank you, very sincerely, for the honour you do me by this morning's call. You have made the offer one might hope to receive at 30 from a man one had married at 16. I must, however, decline it. I was 16 in November 1814, and I am 20 in April 1818, and in the 4 years between I have not been a child. I have read every book of yours you sent me. I have walked your country 3 summers. I have learned your Latin, your tenant rents, your Lincolnshire boundary disputes, and your private opinion of Mr. Coleridge. I did not, at 16, know what I was signing for. I know now. I shall sign it again today, in this room, with your father's deed open upon the table, if you will give me your hand on it. I do not ask you to marry me, Your Grace. I ask you only not to release me before I have decided whether I wish to be released." The cold, pale blue April morning sun came 1 inch further along the boards. Gideon did not speak at once. He had ridden 8 days from Lincolnshire upon the certainty of one answer. He had not, in any of those 8 days, prepared himself for this one. He looked at her. He looked at the small fire. He looked briefly at the silver locket at her throat. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked through 1 full minute. When he spoke at length, his deep, clear, quiet baritone was not less steady, but a little gentler than it had been to her father. "Lady Rosamond, I shall not impose myself on you. I have, however, no wish to impose your release upon you either. May I propose a compromise? That you take a London season this spring, properly chaperoned, with the means to receive any other addresses that may be made, and that at the end of the season, in late summer, you write to me at Tarrington with the answer that no other man's address has shifted, and that, in the meanwhile, the wedding fixed for the 12th of May be quietly postponed, with no public notice of any cause beyond the private wishes of the parties?" She did not look at her father. She did not look at Mrs. Proctor. Her clear, sea-grey eyes did not leave his. "Your Grace," she said very steadily, "I accept the compromise. I shall write to you in late August. I do not, however, undertake to alter my answer." He inclined his head. A small grave bow, exactly the depth that the moment required and no deeper. He spoke briefly to Lord Westbury. He bowed to Mrs. Proctor. He did not, in taking his leave, look again at Rosamond. He did not trust himself to. By 20 minutes past 8, he had taken back his greatcoat, his beaver hat, and the leather riding glove from Mr. Jepson in the hall. By 8:30, he was upon his bay hunter at the foot of the front steps. The cold, pale blue April morning sun was now full upon the lime walk, and the gravel of the avenue was pale in it, and his breath and the horses were small white clouds in the air. Rosamond stood at the long sash window of the small east drawing-room and watched him. She did not move when he took up the reins. She did not move when he turned the bay's head. She did not move when he rode out at the slow, careful pace of a man who has not decided whether to gallop. The cold, pale blue April sun caught the strawberry blonde of her hair and made it, for one moment, the warm gold with the copper rose lights it would be by 10. Her father stood at the chimney-piece, his hand upon the marble. Mrs. Proctor stood by the door, her warm, pale blue eyes upon Rosamond's slender, upright back. The bay hunter passed the lime walk. It passed the second gate. It went out of sight beyond the copse. Nobody in the small east drawing-room spoke. The clock on the chimney-piece ticked through the first minute. It ticked through the second. Mrs. Proctor, who had taught Rosamond to read at 6, and to sit a horse at 8, and to write a clean letter at 12, looked at the young woman at the window, and did not speak. Lord Westbury, who had not in 4 years been able to look his daughter in the face for the length of an afternoon, did not speak either. The fire shifted once in the grate. When at last Lady Rosamond Westbury spoke, she did not turn from the window. The cold, pale blue April sun was on her hair, and her clear, sea-grey eyes were very steady upon the empty avenue beyond the lime walk, where the dark figure of the Duke of Tarrington had ridden out of her mourning. Her voice, when it came, was very quiet, and was the first private sentence she had ever spoken in her own house at 20. "Then I shall write." By the afternoon of that same Tuesday, the cold, pale blue Norfolk morning had warmed into something a little gentler. The lime walk beyond the small east drawing-room was beginning, in the slow, honest way of late April in the Norfolk borders, to show the soft green of leaves not yet quite unfolded. The hedgerows along the lane to Westbury Magna had whitened with blackthorn. Within the house there was a quietness that had not been there at the same hour the previous Tuesday, and that would, by degrees, become the quietness of the whole month of May. Lord Lionel Westbury sat at his writing-table in the small library at 4 o'clock, and wrote, in his own hand, a single line to the Reverend Marsden at Tarrington on the walls. He did not embroider it. He stated only that the parties had consented to a deferral of the wedding, fixed for the 12th of May, and that no further notice would be required of the parish. He sealed the letter and gave it to Mr. Jepson to be sent up to Lincolnshire by the evening post. He instructed Mr. Jepson that no servant of Westbury was to mention the matter beyond the green baize door. Mr. Jepson inclined his silver head. By the following morning, the household had folded the news away, as a household will fold a piece of fine linen, neatly and in the cupboard, and not to be looked at by visitors. Through the first fortnight of May, the lime walk greened by half a hue each day. Rosamond kept to her quiet round. She rose at 7. She breakfasted at 8:30 with Mrs. Proctor and her father. The three of them civil and a little careful with one another. She walked alone in the deer park until 10, in a plain brown wool pelisse and a dark green chip bonnet, the silver locket at her throat beneath the fichu. At 10 she went up to her mother. She did not, in those 14 days, write to Lincolnshire, nor mention his name aloud in any room of the house. She had said on the morning of the 28th of April that she would write in late August, and she meant to keep the period of her silence as faithfully as she meant to keep the period of her speech. On the morning of Friday the 15th of May, the post brought down to Westbury Hall a long parcel of stiff parchment in a leather-cornered wrapper, sealed with the small private seal of Mr. Elwood Greenway of Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Jepson set it on the side table in the library beside Lord Westbury's chocolate. Lord Westbury opened it with his small brass paper knife and read it, slowly, through, twice. It was the formal release deed that Mr. Greenway, 54, thinning grey hair under the gold-rimmed spectacles, steady grey eyes, fair indoor pallor, a long scholar's face clean-shaven, tall and thin with a slight stoop, his plain black superfine and his leather portfolio at his side, had drawn up at his desk in Lincoln's Inn upon the Duke's instruction. In plain English, a country solicitor could not have improved. The deed declared in 12 clean clauses that the £80,000 advanced by the late 4th Duke of Tarrington in November of 1814 had been in fact and in conscience a free gift of one old college friend to another, that the Westbury entail of 3 centuries was secure, regardless of what passed between the parties hereinafter, and that the deed of marriage signed between Lord Gideon Tarrington and Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury upon that same November date stood, from the day of its countersigning, released. The Duke had signed it himself in Lincoln's Inn upon the 13th of May. The space for Lord Westbury's countersignature lay clean upon the second leaf, and the space for Lady Rosamond's lay clean upon the third. Lord Westbury countersigned upon the 16th in the small library, with Mr. Jepson and Mrs. Proctor as witnesses. He sent the deed up to Rosamond's sitting-room, with a short civil note, asking her to add her hand at her own convenience. She read it that afternoon at her writing desk, once carefully, and then again. She knew quite well that she did not, in her own private heart, consider herself released. The deed was a paper precaution that Gideon had insisted upon for her protection, that she should hold, against any later accusation, the means in plain English to refuse him. She understood why he had asked the precaution, and she would not refuse him the comfort of having asked it. She took up her quill, dipped it, and signed her name in a clear, even hand, Rosamond Charlotte Westbury. She blotted the page. She gave the deed to Mrs. Proctor to be sealed and returned to Mr. Greenway by the evening post. On Sunday, the 17th of May, after church, Lord Westbury came up the back stair at 3:30 and knocked at the door of his daughter's sitting-room. She bid him enter. He came in with a folded sheet of cream-laid paper in his hand, and his small grey eyes fixed upon the carpet. He did not sit. He held out the letter. He stood at the door while she read it. It was the apology he had not, in 4 years, offered her. He had written it the previous evening at his writing-table, and had crossed out 3 drafts before he had put down the one he had brought up. He named, in plain words, the disaster of October 1814. He named the letting of his daughter's name be set in a deed at 16 against a sum he ought never to have lost. He named the 4 years of silence in which he had not, in his shame, been able to look her in the face. He asked only that she should know, in writing under his hand, that he understood quite exactly what he had done, and that the grief of the understanding had not in those 4 years left him for an hour. Rosamond read it twice. She was in her plain navy blue wool morning gown, the small silver locket on its black silk cord at her throat, her strawberry blonde hair smooth in the low chignon. She did not weep, and she did not, when she had finished, look up. She folded the sheet quietly along its first crease. She thanked him in 3 words. He inclined his head and withdrew without looking at her, and went down the back stair at the same slow, careful pace at which he had come up. She replied the next morning. She took a fresh sheet of cream-laid paper from the small drawer of the writing desk and dipped her quill and wrote, in her clear, even hand, 2 careful lines. Sir, I forgive you. The matter is closed in my heart. We shall not speak of it again. She did not, in the salutation, name him as father. She had considered the word, with the quill held above the page, for the length of one slow breath, and had set it aside. She blotted the page. She folded it. She sealed it with her own small wax seal, the Westbury crest, no more, and took it down herself to the side table in the hall, and laid it there for Mr. Jepson to carry through to her father at his chocolate. Lord Westbury read the 2 lines at his writing table at 9:30. He folded the sheet in half. He folded it again. He noticed, as she had known he would, that she had not named him. He sat at his table for some minutes without moving. Then he took out his folded handkerchief and wept once, briefly into it, and put it away again before the housemaid came in to lay the small fire, and went down to luncheon at 1, as a man who had been given more than he had deserved, and meant to deserve it now. Lady Millicent Westbury, 49, in the chronic ill health that had been her companion since the winter of 1814, her soft, fading blonde hair under its white lace cap with the pale pink ribbon, her anxious, pale blue eyes set in a soft, round, tired face, her fair skin gone ill-pallid with the long indoor years, dove-grey silk in soft self-mourning for the engagement she had not at the time been strong enough to prevent, wrote her own letter from her chamber on the 18th of May. It was a longer letter than her husband's, and a softer one, and was wet in 2 places by the time she had folded it. She sent it down to Rosamond by her own maid. Rosamond went up to her mother that afternoon at 4. She sat upon the small low chair beside the bed, took her mother's thin pale hand in her own, and listened. Lady Millicent spoke, for the first time in 4 years, of the original deed of November 1814. She had not opposed it. She had been ill, and she had been frightened for the entail, and she had told herself that 3 years and a half were a great deal of time, and that the matter would settle as such matters did. She had not foreseen the 4 years of her daughter's slow, careful preparation. She had not foreseen what the preparation would cost. She apologized in plain Norfolk English without embellishment. Rosamond forgave her in the same plain English without embellishment. The 2 of them sat quiet for some minutes after, while a thrush sang on the lime outside the leaded window. From that afternoon Rosamond visited her mother every day in May at 4. They began to read together. They began with Cowper, who was Lady Millicent's old comfort. They went on after a week to Wordsworth, and at the end of the 3rd week Mrs. Proctor brought up a small new volume of Miss Edgeworth from the Lending Library at Norwich, and the 3 of them read it through aloud by turns in the slow gold afternoons of late spring, Lady Millicent's pale blue eyes lost a quarter of their tiredness in those 3 weeks. The colour came back into her cheeks by half a hue. She laughed once at a passage in the Edgeworth, and the sound was a small, bright thing in the upstairs corridor that Mr. Jepson, passing below, paused for a quarter of a second to listen to. In the middle of the same week, Wednesday the 20th of May, by the morning's post, there came down to Westbury from Cavendish Square a letter in a fine sloping hand that Lady Millicent knew at once. It was from Lady Viola Hardwicke. Lady Viola was 56, the widow of Sir Richard Hardwicke, who had died at the end of 1813. Her soft, silver grey was pinned in a coronet beneath a small grey lace widow's cap, her shrewd, warm, pale blue eyes set in a fair, finely lined face with a kind, firm, oval mouth, her medium-slim figure habitually in the lavender silk of half-mourning with a white lace fichu and the small jet brooch at her throat. She was Lady Millicent's oldest friend. She had heard, by the careful private channels through which such things were heard in London, that something was unsettled at Westbury, and that a London season had not been provided for. She wrote to offer Cavendish Square. She had her Almack's vouchers in hand through her late husband's connections. She undertook to introduce Rosamond properly, in the proper rooms, to the proper men of consequence. She would expect her by the 1st of June. Lady Millicent read the letter twice, and wept with relief. She called for Rosamond's writing desk to be brought into her chamber at once, and at 3 that very afternoon, with her daughter at her elbow and Mrs. Proctor at the door, she wrote Lady Viola a reply in her own faltering hand, accepting on Rosamond's behalf. Rosamond signed beneath her mother's name. The reply went out by the evening post. Late May brought home the brother nobody at Westbury had quite remembered to write to, Viscount Anselm Westbury, 26, strawberry blonde like his sister and worn in the fashionable Brutus cut, sea-grey eyes a little brighter than hers in a fair face tanned by a year of Vienna and Florence sun, an open kind face on a tall slim frame, dark green country coat, buff waistcoat, brown-topped boots. Arrived at the front door of Westbury Hall in a hired chaise from Norwich at 4 o'clock on Monday the 25th of May, having heard at no point upon the journey one syllable of the morning of the 28th of April. Lord Westbury met him in the hall and took him through to the small library, and there, in one quiet hour, told him what had passed. Anselm did not interrupt. When his father was done, he turned at length and said only, "I shall go up to her now, sir, if I may." Lord Westbury inclined his silver head. Anselm went up. He knocked at his sister's sitting-room at 6. She bid him enter. He came in the dark green country coat, the buff waistcoat still travel-creased, the brown-topped boots not yet cleaned. She was at her writing-desk in the plain navy-blue wool, the silver locket at her throat, the strawberry blonde chignon smooth at the nape, writing the second sheet of a letter to her London modiste, with whom Lady Viola had already been in quiet correspondence regarding the season's wardrobe. She set down her quill. She rose from the desk. She crossed the room and took her brother's hands. He kissed her on the brow. He sat opposite her at the writing-desk. He did not begin with apology, and he did not begin with anger. He looked at her steadily across the small leather top of the desk, with the sea-grey eyes that had been a child's the last time she had looked into them, and that were now, after a year of the continent, a brother's. "Rosie," he said, in a voice that was steadier than his face, "do you wish to marry the man, or do you not? I shall stand by whichever answer you give me. I shall not press." She let the small silence settle. She thought of the cold, pale blue April morning, and of the long minute in which Gideon had not at first answered her, and of the 8 days he had ridden north out of Lincolnshire to set her free, and of the 4 years of his careful, honourable letters. She lifted her clear sea-grey eyes. "Anselm, I do. I have for 2 years and a half. He has not, until the 28th of April, given me leave to. I shall write to him in August as we agreed. In the meanwhile I shall go to London with Lady Viola, and I shall meet whatever men of consequence the season produces, and I shall refuse them all, civilly in their proper turn. I shall, however, not refuse him. The deed is not the question. The question is the man. Anselm did not smile, because a smile would have been too easy a thing for that small minute, and he did not nod, because a nod would have been too small. He inclined his head, exactly as their father had inclined his at the chimney-piece on the morning of the 28th of April, and exactly as Gideon had inclined his to her at the small east drawing-room window. The Westbury inclination, she thought, had at last begun to mean something honest in this house. Then you shall write to him in August, he said, and you shall come up to London with my approval, and any London suitor who tries to talk you out of it shall be dealt with by your brother. We are agreed. We are agreed, Anselm. I am very glad you have come home. They stood. They embraced briefly, the way a brother and sister will embrace who have found one another the same after a year apart. Then he went down to dinner, and she returned to her writing desk, and finished, in her clear, even hand, the letter to the London modiste regarding 2 sea-grey silk evening gowns and a soft, pale jonquil yellow muslin mourning. She blotted it, she sealed it, she set it on the salver. She blew out the candle at 10:30 and slept that night the soundest sleep she had slept in a fortnight. The 1st of June came up out of the Norfolk dawn, warm and green. The breakfast was quiet. Her mother kissed her once at the bedroom door. Her father kissed her brow at the foot of the great staircase, and could not, when he tried, say more than her name. Anselm handed her into the post-chaise himself. Mrs. Winifred Proctor, silver grey under her starched white linen cap, warm, pale blue eyes, fair Norfolk weathered, the small jet cross at her throat, plain black bombazine and white linen apron, medium of stature at 5'4", slim and brisk, climbed in after her with her travelling bag and a folded grey shawl. Mr. Jepson closed the carriage door. The chaise rolled out of the avenue at 8:30 in a soft summer light that had not yet learned how warm it was going to be. They reached London by 6:30 in the cool blue late spring evening. The post-chaise turned into Cavendish Square and drew up at the steps of Lady Viola Hardwicke's house. The long sash windows of the principal floor stood blue against the soft grey stone. A footman in dark blue livery handed Mrs. Proctor down. Rosamond stepped down after her in her plain travelling pelisse of dove-grey wool, her dark green chip bonnet, the silver locket beneath the fichu. Lady Viola Hardwicke came down the steps to receive them in person, the lavender silk of half-mourning, the white lace fichu, the small jet brooch at her throat, the soft silver grey under the small grey lace widow's cap, the shrewd, warm, pale blue eyes, very steady upon her old friend's daughter. She did not greet her as a chaperone receives a charge. She greeted her as a woman receives the daughter of her oldest friend. She kissed Rosamond on both cheeks. "My dear, you are very welcome. We shall, between us, make a season of it. Mrs. Proctor, you are quite as welcome. Your room is at the head of the second flight, next to my own." She herself went up the great staircase ahead of them and showed Rosamond into the Cavendish Square blue bedchamber on the principal floor, a fine, quiet room, papered in soft, dove blue. A half-tester bed hung in pale blue silk, a small writing desk by the leaded window from which one looked across the plane trees into the grey-green evening of the square. The cases were carried up. Mrs. Proctor was settled in the small chamber next to Lady Viola's own at the head of the second flight. The house was quiet and warm and smelt faintly of beeswax and of lavender from the linen cupboards. Dinner was at 8, plain and small, for 3 only, Lady Viola at the head of the table in lavender silk, Rosamond upon her right in dove grey, Mrs. Proctor upon her left in plain black bombazine, civil, quiet conversation. Lady Viola spoke of the small private things, the health of Lady Millicent, the bloom of the hawthorn on the road from Norwich. Over the soup, in her own time, she laid out the season's plan. Almack's on Wednesday next. An introduction at Lady Henley's music hall on the Friday following. A morning call at Lady Albemarle's on the Tuesday after. Rosamond inclined her head at each. The pudding came in. The candles were lit. The conversation eased. By 10:30, the household had gone quiet. Mrs. Proctor saw her young lady to the door of the blue bedchamber. She kissed her on the brow as she had been kissing her on the brow at bedtime since 1809. She withdrew up the second flight to her own chamber. Rosamond did not at once undress. She crossed the soft Wilton carpet to the small writing desk by the leaded window. She set the single tall beeswax candle in its plain silver holder upon the leather top, and she struck the small flint and lit it. The cold blue June evening had gone full dark beyond the window, and the plane trees of the square were a soft blackness against the lamp-lit grey of the house opposite. The candle threw a steady warm gold upon the leather and upon her hands and upon the small silver locket at her throat. She opened the second drawer of the writing desk. She drew out a small new volume of plain laid paper, half bound in dove-blue calf, that she had purchased 2 days before in Norwich at Mr. Stevenson's stationer's against this hour. She set it open upon the leather. She dipped her quill, very carefully, in the small inkstand. She held it for one slow breath above the page. Then, in her clear, even hand, she wrote upon the first leaf, London, the 1st of June, 1818. I shall keep this book against my own forgetting. I love him already. I shall not love him less for having been given the means to refuse him. Ah. She blotted it twice with the small square of blotting paper. She closed the journal. She set it carefully into the second drawer of the writing desk, and turned the small brass key, and laid the key in the inkstand. She blew out the candle. The Cavendish Square blue bedchamber went quiet and dark, and the soft June night came in at the leaded window across the plane trees, and Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, 20 years of age, slept. The first morning at Cavendish Square came in with a soft, quiet warmth that the country had not prepared her for. Rosamond woke in the half-tester bed at a few minutes after 7, and lay for a minute with her clear sea-grey eyes upon the pale blue silk above her, listening to the small sounds of a London house already at its work, a milk cart in the square, the soft tread of a maid upon the back stair, the whisper of a coal being laid 2 rooms away. The plane trees stood very green at the leaded window, their leaves still damp from the night rain. Mrs. Proctor came in at the half-hour with the chocolate pot, pinned a stray copper rose wisp at Rosamond's temple, and said nothing more than was needful. By 11, Rosamond had been formally taken in hand. Lady Viola Hardwicke, in lavender silk and the small jet brooch and the soft silver grey beneath the widow's cap, brought her down to the morning room and set out, without flourish, the working programme of the season. Almack's vouchers were to be obtained on Wednesday the 3rd of June. Lady Viola's word in the matter was as good as the patroness's, for she had been at school with 2 of them and had outlived a third's husband. Lady Henley's music hall on the Friday following, the 5th, would be Rosamond's first proper appearance in society. Lady Albemarle's morning call would follow on the Tuesday, the 9th. Hyde Park was to be driven in every afternoon at 5 in Lady Viola's open landau, with the dove-grey hood let down. Rosamond inclined her head at each item, and Lady Viola observed her once over the rim of her teacup, and made her own private decision that the girl was not to be hurried, and not to be polished, and not to be presented as anything other than what she was. The vouchers came through on the Wednesday by a quiet morning note. The musicale on the Friday was got through with composure. Rosamond in pale jonquil yellow muslin, with white lawn fichu and plain white kid gloves to the wrist, the small silver locket beneath the fichu, the strawberry blonde hair pinned smoothly low. She was presented to a sufficiency of dowagers and their daughters and their sons, and she gave each her hand with the same composed, grave courtesy, and did not, in any introduction, name the Duke of Tarrington. Lady Henley told Lady Viola over a glass of orgeat that the girl was a credit to her old friend's house, and Lady Viola accepted the compliment with the small dignity of a woman who had not asked for it. Lady Albemarle's call on the Tuesday was a quieter matter. They sat half an hour in the small saloon at Albemarle Street. Lady Albemarle, who had known Lady Millicent at Bath in 1797, asked after her with the kindness of an old friendship. The Reverend Almondbury, a thin, white-haired clergyman from a Norfolk living adjacent to Westbury, looked in for 10 minutes upon a small parish errand, paid his respects, and went away again. So the days went forward through the 2nd week of June and into the 3rd. The drives in Hyde Park at 5 o'clock were the unvarying punctuation of the afternoon. The Row at its busiest, the fashionable carriages in slow circulation, the bows from open landaus. Rosamond sat very upright in dove-grey or pale jonquil at Lady Viola's side, her white-gloved hands folded, and was driven home at 6:30 to dress for the evening. Almack's was got through on a Wednesday in the 2nd week, 2 country dances, lemonade, home by midnight. Lady Caversham's rout, Lady Bracknell's evening party, the small private ball at Lady Henley's house in mid-June, each was entered upon and carried through with the same quiet composure. It was not, in plain truth, what Rosamond would have called pleasure. There was a great deal that was novel and civil and kindly meant, and yet underneath the civilities there moved, in her own private heart, a small steady undertow of loneliness. The loneliness of a young woman performing a season she had not wished to enjoy, on behalf of a question she had already answered in the small East drawing-room at Westbury Hall on the 28th of April. She did not, however, neglect any of its observances. She had given her word, and a young woman who held a man to his honour was bound, in turn, to her own. Lord Jasper Fenwick first crossed her path at Lady Henley's ball on the Friday of the 3rd week of June, at the end of his first cotillion. He came up to her with practised charm in a crimson tailcoat with gilt buttons, the primrose yellow silk waistcoat very fresh against the buff pantaloons, the top boots with their small brass tassels just visible beneath, the quizzing glass upon a black silk ribbon already half raised. The wavy honey-blonde hair was tied at the nape with its black silk, and the shallow, pale hazel eyes, heavy-lidded over a fair, fresh complexion, gone a faint bruised tone at the right eye from claret too well kept, moved over her with the slow, practised assessment of a man who had been doing this for 15 seasons. He was conventionally handsome. The full red mouth, the slightly weak chin, and its small dimple, the medium slim build at 5'10", elegantly slouched. He bowed. He inquired whether her ladyship might be persuaded to favour him with the supper dance. Rosamond gave him her hand for the briefest civility, and withdrew it. She replied in the soft, warm contralto that she was already engaged for the supper dance. She thanked him very civilly. She did not, in any line of her composed, sea-grey eyes, give him the encouragement he was looking for. Lord Jasper smiled the practised smile, and bowed and withdrew. And across the room, Lady Viola, watching from the dowager's bench, set down her glass of orgeat with the small precision of a woman who had marked a name. He made his first formal call at Cavendish Square on Tuesday the 23rd of June at 3 o'clock. Lady Viola received him in the small drawing-room with iron civility. She sat in her usual chair at the chimney-piece in lavender silk, the shrewd, warm, pale blue eyes very level above her teacup, and she did not, at any point in the call, withdraw to the further window upon any pretext whatever. Rosamond sat upright in pale jonquil upon the sofa, her hands folded, and answered Lord Jasper's small civilities in 3 civil words at a time. He had brought a small posy of June roses. He stayed precisely the requisite quarter hour and not a minute beyond. He returned 3 further times in the course of July, each call shorter than the last, a quarter hour, 12 minutes, 10 minutes, 8, and was each time received with the same iron courtesy, and she did not, on any of those occasions, leave the room. Twice he proposed a short walk in Hyde Park. Rosamond declined each time courteously on the score of a previous engagement. The first formal proposal came by private letter, not upon the knee. Lord Jasper sent it from his lodgings in Half Moon Street on Saturday the 11th of July, and it arrived at Cavendish Square upon the Sunday salver. Rosamond took it up to the blue bedchamber and read it once at the small writing desk by the leaded window. It was a perfectly competent piece of its kind. The practised civil opening, the gentlemanly disclaimer, the formal request to be permitted to address her father. And it answered itself. She set it upon the desk. She did not put it in the fire. On Monday the 13th, she wrote her reply in 3 civil lines, declining with thanks, sealed it with her grandmother's small silver seal, and laid it upon the salver to be sent. She did not show his letter to Lady Viola. She did, however, inform her in person that afternoon of the refusal, a single quiet sentence at the chimney-piece. Lady Viola did not look up at once from the plane hemming in her lap. When she did look up, the shrewd, warm, pale blue eyes had a faint, level dryness in them. "My dear, he shall not be the last. We shall, however, hope he is the most importunate." The rest of July ran on through the long, warm yellow afternoons in the same composed pattern. The Hyde Park drives, the morning calls, the evening parties, and in their interstices, Rosamond's own private quiet, the half-hour each morning at her writing desk over the small dove-blue calf journal, the half-hour after dinner with Mrs. Proctor and a book, the Sunday letter to Westbury. Her mother's letters came up at the rate of 1 a week, full of the small things, the gardener, the white roses, the slow, improving warmth of her own room. Anselm wrote less regularly and more briefly. He was watching the matter from Westbury, and any London business that began to require attention should be sent to him by the next post. Late July brought the Marlborough Ball at Hanover Square upon Friday the 24th, 28, to dinner before the dance. Rosamond dressed for it in the long quiet of the late summer afternoon. The high-waisted, soft, sea-grey silk evening gown that had been her mother's was laid out upon the bed. The short puff sleeves freshly pressed, the single narrow row of small antique seed pearls along the hem catching a faint gleam from the late sun. Mrs. Proctor dressed her hair, the strawberry blonde pinned in the smooth low chignon at the nape with small wisps at the temples and a single small white rose, freshly cut from Lady Viola's back garden, tucked at the right temple. The long white kid gloves to above the elbow, the small silver locket on its black silk cord, her mother's small silver and aquamarine drop earrings at the lobes. She stood once before the long pier glass, turned away, and went down. Marlborough House at Hanover Square was lit through every window when the carriage drew up at 7:30. The dinner saloon was a long, pale yellow room with 3 chandeliers and 28 chairs at the great mahogany table. Rosamond and Lady Viola were received by Lady Marlborough and drawn into a small group of 3 matrons by the further chimney-piece. Lady Calantha Stanbury came across the saloon to them with the practised, easy gait of a woman who had not, in 8 seasons, wanted for an introduction. The glossy mahogany brown hair was dressed in the fashionable Greek coronet, with 3 thin pearl ropes wound through it. The large brown eyes with their practiced long lashes were already smiling. The alabaster of the lightly powdered skin was very smooth above the deep coral silk evening gown, with its short, puff sleeves, the parure of small rubies and pearls at the throat and ears and wrists. She was conventionally beautiful. The full red mouth, the medium slim build at 5'7", the long white kid gloves drawn very smooth, and she came up to Rosamond's elbow with a small, sharp smile that was not quite a smile. "Lady Rosamond, how charming to meet you in town. I have heard from a Norfolk acquaintance. Pray tell me, is your engagement to my cousin Tarrington really so definitely off? The recent excitements at Westbury Hall in April do circulate so." The small group at the chimney-piece went very quiet. The candles upon the mantel did not, of course, alter. The small civil hum of the saloon did not falter, but the 3 matrons turned their heads by perhaps a 1/4 inch and waited. Lady Viola Hardwicke set down her teacup upon the small marble side table with a small, precise click. She turned, in lavender silk and the small jet brooch, and the soft silver grey beneath the widow's cap, and the shrewd, warm, pale blue eyes came up level upon Lady Calantha Stanbury, and she spoke in the perfectly even voice of a woman who had been mistress of a Sussex household at 22 and a London one at 24. "Lady Calantha, I do not believe I have introduced you. The young woman at my elbow is Lady Rosamond Westbury, who is at present my guest at Cavendish Square. The state of any private engagement of hers is, I believe, not the proper concern of any Norfolk acquaintance, and certainly not of a Lincolnshire cousin who has not been written to upon the matter. Lord Marlborough's footmen are about to announce dinner. I shall be obliged for your place at the table." It was 3 sentences, civilly spoken, in the level, even voice. Lady Calantha opened her mouth a 1/4 inch and shut it, and the alabaster of her cheek went 1 shade paler beneath the powder, and at that same moment the butler announced dinner, and Lady Calantha, without curtsying, without speaking, turned upon her satin slipper and walked towards the table. She sat through the 5 removes, with no neighbour speaking to her, beyond what civility absolutely required. She was conspicuously alone on Lady Marlborough's arm in the saloon afterward. She did not dance. She removed to Brighton on Saturday the 1st of August, and was not, that summer, again seen in Hanover Square. Rosamond did not speak through any of it. She gave Lady Viola her arm into the dining saloon when the procession formed, and they went in together, and the Marlborough dinner went forward. Lord Jasper Fenwick came up to her afterward in the small ante-room beyond the dancing saloon at the close of the 3rd country dance, in the same crimson tailcoat and primrose yellow silk waistcoat, the wavy honey-blonde hair tied very neat at the nape, the quizzing-glass already half raised, and inquired whether her ladyship might now do him the honour of the supper-dance. Rosamond declined civilly. Lord Jasper smiled the practised smile, bowed, and withdrew, and Rosamond saw him, 20 minutes later, standing alone at the further end of the supper-room with a glass of claret in his hand, and a small acid expression about the slightly weak chin. Early August brought his 2nd letter. It came up to Cavendish Square from Half Moon Street upon the Wednesday salver, the 5th of August, and it was, in plain language, a very different document from the first. Civil still, in form, the same practised hand. But beneath the civility, half veiled in the manner of a man who knew exactly how far a sentence could go before it became actionable, ran the suggestion that his private knowledge of certain matters, a deed of November 1814, a release of late April 1818, a duke arriving at the door of Westbury Hall at 20 minutes past 6, would, if aired in the London press, be inconvenient to her family. Rosamond read it once at the small writing desk in the blue bedchamber. She read it again, slowly, with the steady sea-grey eyes very level. She did not put it in the fire. She folded it precisely along its original creases and carried it down at once to the small drawing-room, where Lady Viola sat at her usual chair with her plain hemming. She laid the letter without speaking upon the small marble side table at her chaperone's elbow. Lady Viola took it up. She read it through in a quiet of perhaps 2 minutes, and did not, in any line of her face, alter. And when she had finished, she folded it again precisely along the same creases and laid it back upon the marble. "My dear, we shall send this letter to Mr. Greenway in Lincoln's Inn this evening. Lord Jasper will receive a reply from a London solicitor by Friday morning." The letter went out by the 4 o'clock post that afternoon, sealed in a fresh outer cover under Lady Viola's own hand, and addressed to Mr. Elwood Greenway at his chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Greenway, who had had his Grace's standing instruction upon the matter in writing since the last week of April, did not need to consult Tarrington Court before he replied. He replied the next morning, Thursday, by a single short letter from Lincoln's Inn to Half Moon Street, in a perfectly even legal hand. Any further correspondence on the subject of the deed of November 1814, or its release of April 1818, would henceforward be answered by the Duke of Tarrington's solicitors only. Any public mention of the matter, in any London paper or any London room, would be met with a libel suit lodged in Lincoln's Inn within 7 days. Lord Jasper Fenwick did not write to Cavendish Square, or to Tarrington, or to any other party connected with the matter, again that summer. The remainder of the season ran on quietly. 2 more evening parties, one Friday afternoon at Almack's, Lady Henley's small farewell route. By the 2nd week of August, fashionable London was in its slow movement towards Brighton or the country. Rosamond prepared to return to Norfolk for 2 weeks before her August letter, and wrote to Anselm to expect her on the 21st. She travelled up by post-chaise on the 20th with Mrs. Proctor, the small dove-blue calf journal in her own dressing-case, and Lady Viola's parting kiss upon both cheeks at the steps of Cavendish Square. They reached Westbury Hall in the cool blue late summer evening, the light just going out of the lime walk, and the rooks coming in low across the home park. Anselm came down the front steps in dark green country coat to hand her down. Lady Millicent, soft fading blonde under her white lace cap, came out into the front hall to receive her, having gained a small colour through the months at Westbury. Lord Lionel had retreated quietly to his study by his own preference, leaving the family pleasures to his children. He came out only for the half-hour after dinner, bowed to his daughter with the same apologetic narrow mouth, and went away again. Through the week of the 21st to the 25th, Rosamond walked each morning in the Westbury Rose Garden in the cool, blue Norfolk dawn, visited the village, and rode her old chestnut mare across the home park in the warm yellow forenoon. She did not, in any of those days, write the letter to Tarrington. She had carried it in her mind all summer. She would not write it until she was certain. On the evening of Wednesday the 26th of August, 1818, after a quiet dinner at which her father had stayed his full half-hour, after a quiet hour with her mother in the small upstairs sitting-room, Rosamond went up to her own bedchamber. She closed the door. She crossed to the writing-desk by the leaded window, and she set the single tall beeswax candle in its plain silver holder upon the leather top, and she struck the small flint and lit it. The Norfolk darkness lay full beyond the leaded window now, a soft, warm blackness over the home park, the small sounds of a country house going quiet. She drew out a fresh half-sheet of plain-laid paper. She dipped her quill. She wrote, in her clear, even hand, the address at the top. Tarrington Court, Lincolnshire. Then, beneath it, in its proper place, Westbury Hall, Norfolk, the 26th of August, 1818. She paused. The candle threw its steady warm gold upon the leather, upon her hands, upon the small silver locket at her throat. She wrote the next line formally, as a young woman ought to write to a duke whom she had not seen for 4 months. Your Grace. She held the quill above the paper for one quiet breath. Then she drew a single firm horizontal line through it, very neatly, with no flourish, and beneath it, in the same composed, even hand, with her own steady, 20-year-old courage, she began again. Gideon, I have had my season. I have been received civilly by every honourable man I encountered, and I have refused them all. I have been pursued by one less honourable than the others, and I have refused him too. My answer is the answer I gave you in our small east drawing room on the 28th of April. It has not altered. I shall not, however, accept your hand without your fresh assent. Not because I doubt yours, but because I will not be the woman who held a man to a deed he had set aside. I shall come to Tarrington Court at your invitation, if you will issue one, and we shall in person speak of what is to be done. Your sometime affianced, Rosamond. She lifted the quill. She read it once, slowly, the clear sea-grey eyes very level upon the page. She blotted it twice. She folded it along its 3 proper folds. She took her grandmother's small silver seal, the seal of the late Lady Arabella Westbury, and pressed it into the small disc of warm wax, and the small Westbury crest came up clear in the candlelight. She set the letter carefully upon the silver salver at the corner of the desk, to be carried down to the front hall before dawn and laid upon the morning post tray. She blew out the candle. The Norfolk darkness came in soft across the leaded window, and Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, 20 years of age, 4 months sometime affianced, the season of London now behind her, and the answer she had carried in her heart since the cold, pale blue April morning at last set down upon the page, stood one quiet minute at her writing desk in her own bedchamber at Westbury Hall, and then she went, composedly, to bed. The Lincolnshire morning of Saturday the 29th of August, 1818, came up warm and gold over the wolds, the late summer haze lifting from the home park at Tarrington Court. The pale Lincolnshire limestone of the Palladian front took the early light kindly. At 9:30, Gideon Henry Tarrington, 5th Duke of Tarrington, sat at the long writing table in his study, in a dark walnut-brown country morning coat, well cut to his lean broad shoulders, a buff waistcoat, buff breeches, and brown-topped boots of soft leather. The Tarrington ducal signet, heavy silver with the stag's head over a pale azure, sat steady upon the smallest finger of his right hand. The one lock of dark russet-brown hair that always fell across his brow when he was at his desk had fallen there now. He had been waiting, in plain truth, for 4 months. The Morning Post tray was at his elbow. The square white half-sheet sealed in warm wax, with the small Westbury crest of Lady Arabella's silver seal, lay third in the tray. He drew it out. He broke the seal cleanly with his thumb. He read the letter in silence, the deep grey-green eyes very steady upon the page, the firm grave mouth quite still. He read it once. He laid it flat upon the leather. He read it again, more slowly. Then he drew towards him a fresh half-sheet of plain-laid paper, took up his quill, dipped it, and within the hour had written the only reply he meant to write, in his clear, measured hand. Madam, I shall send the carriage to Westbury on Monday the 7th of September. My sister Lady Theodosia Tarrington Cove will be at Tarrington that day to receive you, Mrs. Proctor, and any of your family who choose to accompany you. I shall not propose an immediate further conversation upon our subject. I shall merely receive you at Tarrington with the courtesies due a guest of long standing, and shall, after such hours of your company as you shall permit, ask you afresh, at a time of your choosing, whatever question you shall permit me. Yours, in honour, Tarrington. He blotted it. He folded it. He sealed it with the heavy Tarrington signet pressed firm into the warm green wax. He laid it on the salver for the noon mail and stood one quiet minute at the leaded window with his hands behind his back, watching the warm gold morning lie upon the deer park before he went out to Mr. Whitlock at the home farm. The letter reached Westbury Hall by Wednesday the 2nd of September. Rosamond Charlotte Westbury read it twice in her own bedchamber, in her plain navy wool morning gown, the small silver locket at her throat. She did not weep. She rose, crossed to the small enamelled box upon her writing desk in which she had kept all his letters of 4 years, and laid the new letter upon the small, neat stack of the others. She closed the lid. On the morning of Monday the 7th of September, the Tarrington carriage drew up at the front of Westbury Hall. Mrs. Winifred Proctor, in her plain black bombazine and clean white linen cap, was already on the step. Lady Millicent, fragile still in her dove-grey self-mourning, kissed her daughter once at the front door and said she should be carried up later in the month upon her own account. Lord Lionel pressed his daughter's hand in silence. Anselm undertook to follow with their father on Saturday the 12th. Rosamond, in pale rose-pink muslin morning gown, with short puff sleeves and white lawn fichu under her travelling cloak, the silver locket at her throat, stepped up into the carriage. The 4 Greys took the avenue at a steady walk and bore her north and west into Lincolnshire through the warm gold late summer. They came in upon Tarrington Court at 5 o'clock in the warm gold late afternoon September light. The pale Lincolnshire limestone Palladian front rose at the head of the long sweep, its pediment and Ionic columns set kind and dignified above the gravel. The chestnuts in the avenue had begun to turn at the highest leaves. The carriage drew to its halt at the foot of the broad shallow steps, and at the top of those steps the household stood ready. Rosamond drew her shawl about her shoulders and stepped down. Lady Theodosia Tarrington Cove came forward first, the chestnut-brown coronet under her small grey lace widow's cap quite plain in the September light, her warm grey-green eyes, her brother's eyes exactly, steady and kind upon her guest. The fair, finely lined skin of the oval face carried the quiet of 5 years' widowhood. The lavender silk, half-mourning, fell soft at her medium slim height. The small jet brooch on its black silk cord lay at her throat, the plain gold wedding band on her left hand. She was 35 years of age. She took both Rosamond's hands in her own. "My dear," she said, "you are very welcome to Tarrington. My brother is in the long library. He has asked me to bring you into him in your own time. You shall take whatever time you wish, Mrs." Bertha Hemsworth came next. 60 years of age, iron grey under her starched white linen cap, warm, pale grey eyes, short, stout, brisk in her plain black bombazine, white linen apron and cap, the large bunch of keys at her silver chatelaine, the grey wool shawl folded across her arms. She made her curtsy at the proper distance and said in her clean, steady Lincolnshire voice, "Welcome to Tarrington, Lady Rosamond." Mr. Silas Whitlock stood at her right shoulder, 53 years of age, close-cropped iron-grey hair, the steady pale blue eyes of a Lincolnshire weathered man, the square, honest, clean-shaven face, medium broad and lean and strong in his dark brown wool country coat, buff waistcoat, brown cord breeches, brown leather gaiters. He inclined his head. Beyond him, in the long quiet line down the steps, 30 servants stood in their proper places. Rosamond went along the line. She gave each of them her hand. Mrs. Hemsworth named each in her clean voice, and to each Rosamond spoke, by name one quiet sentence, with her clear sea-grey gaze steady, with the small composed warmth of a young woman who had been taught very deliberately for 4 years. She did not hurry. She did not miss one of them. The boot boy at the far end blushed scarlet and managed his bow. Mrs. Hemsworth that evening in the steward's room, with her tea before her on the scrubbed deal table, said quietly to Mr. Whitlock, "Mr. Whitlock, we have a duchess in fact, if not yet by deed. She did not miss one of them. The late master would have been pleased." Mr. Whitlock, who had served under the late 4th Duke for 25 years, said only, "Aye, Mrs. Hemsworth, he would." Supper that evening in the small green dining room was a quiet, civil thing. Gideon at the head of the table in his black, superfine evening tailcoat and white cravat, Theodosia opposite at the foot in her lavender silk, Rosamond on the Duke's right in her cornflower blue silk evening gown with its short puff sleeves and white lace trim, Mrs. Proctor at her elbow in the proper black. The talk was of the journey, of the Norfolk roads, of Lady Millicent's slow recovery, of the home farm. Gideon asked no question that touched the deed. Rosamond offered no answer that lay near it. The candles burned steady on the polished mahogany. At 9, Rosamond rose, took her leave with a small, quiet curtsy, and went up to the blue guest chamber that overlooked the walled rose garden, Mrs. Proctor at her side. The dressing chamber next door had been made up clean and warm for the elder woman. Rosamond undressed in the quiet, the pale rose-pink muslin laid by, and slept dreamlessly under the soft blue silk hangings. Through the second week of September, Lady Theodosia took her in hand. Each morning after breakfast, the two women went out into the deer park in cream cashmere shawls. Theodosia's chestnut-brown coronet under her small grey lace widow's cap, Rosamond's strawberry-blonde chignon catching the autumn sun, and walked the long beach walk down to the lake and back, talking of the late 4th Duke, of Theodosia's late husband Lord Cove, who had fallen at Salamanca in the year 12, of their childhood under their mother Lady Augusta. After their walks, they read in the long library. They walked the Tarrington apartments, the state suite, the Tudor Great Hall, the long gallery hung with the Tarrington portraits, 400 years deep, where Theodosia named each of the painted faces in their careful order. In the music room, soft cream paper above pale wainscot, a Broadwood pianoforte by the window, and a small gilt harp in the corner, Rosamond sat for the first time at Tarrington at the keyboard, and played quietly an old border country air her mother had taught her at Westbury. Theodosia, in her chair by the fire, did not speak through the playing. When it was done, she said only, "My dear, that was very pretty." The autumn light moved in soft squares across the pale wainscot. In the orangery, the long glass and iron Georgian orangery at the south end of the house, with its tall arched windows and white-painted ironwork, and its line of dark green Tarrington orange trees in their great oak tubs, the small ripe oranges hanging in clusters among the dark glossy leaves, they sat one warm afternoon as the autumn sun came kind through the glass, and Theodosia spoke of her mother's planting of these very trees in 1791. Rosamond listened with the composed steadiness she had brought to every room of the house since her arrival. Saturday the 12th of September brought Lord Lionel and Anselm up from Norfolk. The carriage came in upon Tarrington at 6. Anselm, strawberry blonde, sea grey, fair tanned from the continent, dark green country coat, buff waistcoat, brown-topped boots, leapt down and embraced his sister with the easy frankness he had always shown her. Lord Lionel, thinning silver grey, in dark blue morning coat and dove-grey waistcoat, kissed her brow and pressed her hand and went indoors with no speech. The party at Tarrington was now Gideon, Theodosia, Rosamond, Mrs. Proctor, Lord Lionel, Anselm. On Sunday the 13th, after church at St. Stephen's, Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, where Reverend Obadiah Marsden had given a quiet, steady sermon upon patience, the afternoon was so high and cold and clear and gold that Gideon proposed a ride out. Rosamond came down in a dark blue habit, her strawberry blonde hair drawn into a smooth, low knot, beneath a small black beaver hat with a single grey ostrich feather. In the stable yard stood his bay hunter, and beside him a quiet grey mare named Darling, 15 hands, a kind dark eye, a soft muzzle, her bridle plain. Rosamond went to the mare without ceremony, laid her gloved palm upon the grey neck, and let the mare smell her. The mare blew once and was content. Gideon tossed her up. They rode out, Theodosia and Anselm at a small civil distance behind, through the high cold gold of the Lincolnshire wolds. The sky was very pale. The bracken was beginning to turn. A single hawk hung over the wold above them. They spoke quietly of the estate as they rode, of the home farm, of the bridge at the south boundary, of the small dispute over a hedge at the lower end of the parish that Mr. Whitlock had settled in July, of the good harvest. Gideon asked no question that touched her. Rosamond offered no answer that touched him. The afternoon was the quietest of trust. After an hour they turned for home, through a stand of beech, the leaves coming down soft, and Rosamond looking once across at Gideon as he rode, finding him not looking at her, but ahead at the road, the firm grave mouth quite still, thought, with the small quiet certainty that had been gathering in her since April, that she had been a very fortunate woman. Wednesday the 17th was warm again, with a soft blue haze upon the wolds. After breakfast, Theodosia announced that she meant to go out to the walled rose garden with a pair of secateurs against the last of the late roses, and would not be sorry to be left to it for an hour. She took her shawl and went. Rosamond, in pale rose-pink muslin morning gown, with short puff sleeves and white lawn fichu, the silver locket at her throat, walked with Gideon along the south corridor and into the orangery. He was in his dark walnut-brown country coat, buff waistcoat, buff breeches, brown-topped boots, the Tarrington signet upon his hand. They walked the length of it together among the tall, arched windows and the dark, glossy orange trees, and they spoke. They spoke of his late father, the 4th Duke, who in his last year had grown so thin that his old waistcoats had to be taken in twice. They spoke of her late grandmother, Lady Arabella Westbury, born in 1735 and dying in the spring of 1813, who had taught Rosamond her first French and her first lesson in standing very still while one was being looked at. They did not speak of the deed. They did not speak of April. The autumn sun came warm through the glass. An hour passed, and Theodosia returned with a small basket of late pink and white roses, and the morning closed. So came Thursday, the 24th of September. The day had been warm and gold and very still upon the wolds. After dinner at 5, Theodosia withdrew quietly to write a letter. Anselm went out to the stables. Lord Lionel was in the small library with Mr. Whitlock and a glass of the late master's claret. The cool Lincolnshire September dusk was gathering. Rosamond, still in pale rose-pink muslin morning gown, with short puff sleeves and white lawn fichu, the silver locket at her throat, went down through the south corridor to the orangery as if she had no purpose in particular. Gideon, in his dark walnut-brown country coat, the Tarrington signet on his hand, was already there. The orangery was quiet. The tall, arched windows held the soft, pale blue Lincolnshire dusk. The dark green orange trees stood in their patient line. Near the south wall, a small marble bench, very old, stood at a slight angle. On the checkered limestone paving at its foot lay a single small, ripe orange that had fallen from the nearest tree. Rosamond saw it. She crossed the few paces to the bench. She bent, her gloved hand to the cool paving, the muslin folding soft about her, and lifted the small orange. It was warm in her gloved palm. She straightened. Gideon was half a step behind her. He had crossed without sound. As she came up, he reached and took her gloved hand, gently, carefully, the way a man takes the hand of a woman he has spent 4 months and 26 days teaching himself to deserve, and turned it palm upward in his own. The orange rolled in its small scarlet warm shape down the slope of her white kid glove and dropped soft to his other palm. He did not look at it. He looked at the inner curve of her wrist, where the white kid stopped at the edge of the muslin sleeve, where the small soft skin of her arm began. He bent his head. He kissed her, closed mouth, dignified, once upon the inner wrist. She did not draw the wrist away. She lifted her clear sea-grey eyes very quietly to his face. He set the orange on the bench. He kept her hand in his. He looked down at her one full second, the firm, grave mouth steady, the deep, grey-green eyes very steady, and at her quiet, upward look, a look of permission so still that another man might have missed it. He bent his head and kissed her once gently upon the mouth. It was a closed-mouth kiss. He did not draw her against him. He stood upright and unhurried, a tall, lean man at 6'1" in a dark, walnut-brown country coat, his free hand still at his side, the kiss the soft, careful kind that is the first asking of a question rather than the answering of one. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. He drew back the small distance of dignity. She did not draw further. She rested her cheek, very briefly against his temple. 3 quiet seconds, no more, and the small warm rose flush rose in her ivory cheek and was gone. She drew back the small further distance. She looked up at him. "Gideon," she said. It was the first time in 4 years and 10 months that she had used his Christian name aloud. To him, he heard it. The deep grey-green eyes did not change, but the mouth altered the smallest possible amount. "Rosamond," he said, in a voice gone rough at the lower edge. "I have been very honourable for 150 days. I find that I am tired of being so honourable when I should rather be your husband." She held his eyes. She did not blush further. The small, composed steadiness that had carried her through 4 years was still upon her, but there was beneath it now a quiet warmth she had not, in his hearing, before allowed. 5 months is a long honour, Gideon," she said. "I shall let you ask the question now." He kept her hand. He did not kneel. She would not have wished it. He stood upright before her in the cool Lincolnshire dusk, in the orangery his grandmother's grandmother had planted, and he asked it with the gravity he had brought down from Lincolnshire in April and had not since put off. "Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, will you marry me freely, on your own account, with no deed of November 1814 attaching, on whatever terms you shall propose, at whatever date you shall name?" She did not answer at once. She let the question lie between them for one full breath, the way a young woman of 20 who had been given the means to refuse it let such a question lie. Then she answered, "Gideon Terrington, I shall freely, with no deed attaching, upon a single condition, that we be married at St. Stephen's, Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, in the last week of October, by Reverend Marsden, with my brother to give me away, with my mother carried up from Westbury in your warmest carriage, and with no further postponement of any kind." He inclined his head, the smallest, gravest inclination, the way the late 4th Duke had inclined his head to her grandmother, across a Lincolnshire dining table in the year 9. "Madam," he said, "we are agreed." He raised her gloved hand and kissed it once more. The back of the hand this time, very gently, the way a man kisses the hand of the woman he is to marry. He laid her hand upon his arm. They walked back together along the length of the orangery, past the patient line of orange trees, through the small garden door, up the south corridor, through the long quiet hall, to the foot of the grand staircase. At the foot of the staircase he paused, looked down at her, and said quite simply, "Good night, Rosamond." She said quite simply, "Good night, Gideon." He did not kiss her again. They parted there, and they parted as a couple about to be married rather than as the strangers of April. She went up the wide, shallow steps without haste, her gloved hand light upon the polished oak rail. Mrs. Proctor met her at the door of the blue guest chamber with her quiet, pale blue eyes, full of a question she did not put, and Rosamond, with a very small, quiet smile, said only, "I shall sit up a little while alone, Winifred. I am quite well." The blue guest chamber lay quiet beneath its soft blue silk hangings. The candle on the writing desk was burning low. The cool September moon had risen above the walls and lay in a long, pale square, through the leaded panes upon the polished boards. Rosamond, still in the pale rose-pink muslin, her gloves drawn off and folded upon the desk, the small silver locket warm against her skin, crossed to the writing desk. Upon it lay the August letter she had written from Westbury. The small Westbury crest still pressed clean in the warm wax, the firm horizontal line still drawn through the formal "Your Grace," beneath which she had begun again. Gideon had returned it to her hand the day after her arrival, without speech. The way a man returns a letter, he means a woman to keep. She had kept it. She laid her palm upon it for one quiet beat. She drew the small green-bound journal towards her, opened it past the entry of the 1st of June, and turned to the first clean leaf. She took up her quill. She dipped it. In her clear, even hand, with no flourish, she wrote one line. "He asked. I said yes. I shall not write further this evening. Ah." She blotted it. She closed the journal. She set the quill in its tray. She blew out the candle. The cool September moon lay long across the polished boards of the blue guest chamber, and Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, 20 years of age, 4 months sometime affianced in spring, 4 hours newly affianced in autumn, the orangery and the ride out, and the warm gold September of Tarrington behind her, and the last week of October before her, went, composedly, to bed. The first week of October came down upon the Lincolnshire wolds in cold gold weather, the chestnut avenue at Tarrington dropping its leaves in earnest. Lord Lionel Westbury and Viscount Anselm had set off for Norfolk on the 2nd of the month to bring up Lady Millicent for the wedding. Tarrington Court had quieted into the small, composed household of the late season. Gideon at his study desk most mornings, Lady Theodosia in the small green breakfast room with her work-basket, Rosamond moving between the library and the rose garden in her plain dark blue morning gown, the small silver locket on its black silk cord at her throat. The bells of St. Stephen's rang clear over the wolds at noon and at 6, and the wedding band had been read on the previous Sunday. Into this composure, on the morning of Wednesday the 7th of October at 10:30, a single letter was carried up to the Duke of Tarrington in his study. It had come down upon the night mail from London. Mr. Hibbard the under-butler laid it upon the silver salver, withdrew, and closed the door with the soft click of a man who had been at Tarrington long enough to know which letters wanted no audience. Gideon read it once. He sat very still. He read it a second time. The hand was educated, the wax black, the seal 3 small carnelians pressed in line. The address at the head was Lord Jasper Fenwick's, in Half Moon Street. The letter was civil in form and ugly in substance. Lord Jasper had heard. He wrote, through certain Norfolk acquaintances whom he was naturally too discreet to name, that a wedding was to be solemnized at Tarrington-on-the-Wolds in the last week of October between the Duke of Tarrington and Lady Rosamond Westbury, the very lady from whom his Grace had, by his own hand, formally released himself and the Westbury family from a deed of November 1814 on the 28th day of April last. Lord Jasper begged leave to call upon his Grace at Tarrington Court upon Friday the 9th of October, upon what he was pleased to term, in his close italic, a small matter of family business arising therefrom. Gideon laid the letter flat. He took it up again, walked the length of the long gallery, and came down to the small green breakfast room at 11:05, where Rosamond was at her work at the round mahogany table, and Theodosia at her embroidery by the window. Theodosia, with the practised tact of a sister of 35, who had read her brother's face in many weathers, gathered her work-basket and removed herself, very quietly, to the morning-room beyond. It had become their pattern that every letter touching her affairs was shown, a habit Gideon had begun in May, when Mr. Greenway had sent down the first formal reply on her behalf. He laid the letter at her elbow now without speech, and stood at the chimney-piece. Rosamond read it. She read it a second time. She read it. Her clear, sea-grey eyes did not change. The faint, warm rose flush across the cheekbones did not deepen. She returned the letter to him with the small, composed movement of a young woman who had carried this man's measure in her pocket for 4 months and had not, in any London room or any Norfolk room, been brought to alter her opinion of him. Gideon, he shall not have a penny. I should be obliged if Mr. Greenway is sent for from London and is at Tarrington on the morning of the 9th. Gideon inclined his head, the smallest grave inclination, and said only, "Madam, we are agreed." He went directly back along the gallery to his study, and wrote before the noon post to Mr. Elwood Greenway in Lincoln's Inn. He sent the letter under his own seal. Mr. Greenway came down by post-chaise on the afternoon of Thursday the 8th of October. He dined with the family in the small green dining-room, 54 years old, thinning grey hair, gold-rimmed spectacles, long scholar's face clean-shaven, plain black superfine, with the unhurried civility of a man who knew that the proper preparation for a difficult morning was a quiet evening. The morning of Friday the 9th came in clear and cool. By 8 o'clock, Gideon and Mr. Greenway were at the long writing-table in the library, the Westbury-Tarrington correspondence file open between them. They went through it page by page, the deed of November 1814, executed under the seals of 2 attorneys, the release deed of the 28th of April 1818, executed by both parties in the presence of Mrs. Winifred Proctor, Mr. Pinkerton of King's Lynn's countersigned copy from the Westbury solicitor, Lord Jasper's first half-veiled letter of early August, with Mr. Greenway's own 3-line reply pinned beneath it. By 10 o'clock, the long library was set for what Mr. Greenway, in the dry private idiom of his profession, called a paper interview. 11 o'clock at Tarrington. The house had gone perfectly quiet. The post-chaise from London came up the gravel sweep and stopped before the south portico, and Lord Jasper Fenwick stepped down. He was 35, medium 5'10", slim, with wavy honey-blonde hair tied at the nape with a black silk ribbon, the shallow, pale hazel eyes heavy-lidded. The fair, fresh complexion bore at the eye the small bruise of a London claret, the full red mouth and slightly weak chin were as the family knew them. He wore his dark claret tailcoat with gilt buttons, his primrose yellow silk waistcoat, his buff pantaloons, his top boots with brass tassels. The quizzing glass on its black silk ribbon hung at his breast. 3 carnelian seals depended from his fob. He was shown directly into the long library at Tarrington Court. The room had been set for him with the deliberate composure of a chessboard. At the long writing-table in the centre sat Gideon Tarrington, 5th Duke of Tarrington, in his dark blue superfine morning coat, the white cravat properly tied, the black silk waistcoat plain, the charcoal pantaloons, the polished black Hessian boots, the heavy silver Tarrington signet with the stag's head over the pale azure on the small finger of his right hand. He did not rise. He inclined his head 1/4 inch. At the small rosewood table by the leaded window, Lady Rosamond Westbury was composedly at her work in her plain dark blue morning gown with the white lawn fichu at the throat, the small silver locket on the black silk cord, her hands ungloved and folded one upon the other. She did not rise. She did not look at Lord Jasper. She looked, with the steady directness of a young woman who had refused this man 3 times in 3 London rooms, at her own folded hands, and presently at the leaded window. In the central chair, upright with her embroidery frame across her knee, sat Lady Theodosia Tarrington Cove in her lavender silk half-mourning, the jet brooch at her throat, the chestnut-brown coronet under the small grey lace widow's cap. Her warm, grey-green eyes moved once across Lord Jasper as a drawing-master's eye moves across a poor sketch, and returned without comment to her work. At the side table, with his leather portfolio open and the Lord Jasper correspondence folder laid composedly to his hand, sat Mr. Elwood Greenway in his plain black superfine, the thin gold-rimmed spectacles set firm upon his long nose. At the chimney-piece, in his plain black clerical coat, with the white collar band and the small silver crucifix on a black silk cord, stood the Reverend Obadiah Marsden, 51, soft silver-grey hair, clear honest hazel eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles, long, kind, clean-shaven face, slight stoop, whom his Grace had asked the previous evening to attend as witness. There was no weapon anywhere in the room. Lord Jasper made his bow to the room. He took the chair set for him before the writing table. He embarked, with the practised, oily fluency of a man who had carried this errand in his head from London, upon the matter that had brought him north. His proposition was put at length. He held in his private papers, he said, certain observations upon the propriety of the proposed marriage, observations arising from the November 1814 deed and its formal release in the April following. He could not, in conscience, suppose that the public press of London would be entirely uninterested in the matter, nor that a Norfolk acquaintance of his, however discreet, might not in the warmth of conversation drop a hint here or there. He was, however, content to keep the whole matter from the said press, and from any parlour or club-room in town, for a private consideration. He named the figure with a small bow, £10,000, paid to himself in Half Moon Street, before the wedding banns were finally read at Tarrington-on-the-Wolds. He sat back. He set his quizzing-glass to his eye, and waited. Mr. Greenway did not rise. He did not raise his voice. He did not, indeed, alter the position of his hands upon the leather of the side table. He cleared his throat once, in the dry manner he had brought with him from Lincoln's Inn for 30 years, and addressed himself in plain order to each implied head of Lord Jasper's claim. Upon the first head, my lord, the deed of November 1814 was a private contract between 2 consenting families, lawfully executed under the seals of 2 attorneys, His Grace's late father's man, Mr. Carteret, the Westbury family's man, Mr. Pinkerton of King's Lynn. It was as lawfully released, in mutual amity, by both parties on the 28th day of April 1818, in the small east drawing-room of Westbury Hall, in the presence of Mrs. Winifred Proctor and of the lady's father in person. The release was countersigned, in copy, by Mr. Pinkerton upon the 15th of May, and has been on file with the Westbury solicitor, and with myself, since that day. The instrument I now place upon the writing-table is the executed release deed itself. He drew it from his portfolio, and laid it upon the leather. There is, my lord, no impropriety of any kind in the matter that any English court, or any English newspaper of moderate standing, would entertain for a single morning's hearing. Upon the second head. The release was drafted by my own hand to the protection of the lady alone. It was signed in mutual amity by both parties and the lady herself. It is documented twice, once by myself, once by Mr. Pinkerton. It stands. Upon the third head, the private knowledge your lordship is pleased to claim to hold. Mr. Greenway drew a second document from his portfolio and laid it composedly beside the release deed. Your Lordship's own letter of the 7th of August last, in which your Lordship was pleased to suggest, in such half-veiled terms as your Lordship considered prudent, that the released engagement was a matter of Tarrington dishonour. Your Lordship will recollect that I replied, in 3 lines, upon the 10th, warning your Lordship in the plainest professional terms against any public mention. Any further attempt, by speech, by letter, by hint, or by any third party in your Lordship's pay, to publish any aspect of this matter in any London room, club, journal, or private parlour, will be met by a libel suit lodged at Lincoln's Inn within 7 days. The documentary evidence of malicious intent will be your Lordship's own letter, which I have here in my hand. He laid it gently down. Lord Jasper had begun to pale under the bruised eye. Upon the 4th head, my lord. The demand for £10,000. It is, in plain English law, an attempt to extract money from a private gentleman under the implied threat of public injury. It constitutes, under the relevant statute of 1812, the criminal offence of extortion. Were the matter laid before a London magistrate this afternoon, the warrant would issue tonight. Were your Lordship's person taken at Half Moon Street at dawn tomorrow, your Lordship would lie in Newgate before 48 hours had run from this interview. The Fenwick claim, now upon the table, constitutes, in legal substance, an attempt to extract compensation from a private gentleman in respect of a private deed lawfully released, against an English court that would dismiss the matter in 3 minutes upon a single morning's hearing. He folded his hands. The long library was very quiet. The leaded window admitted the cool, pale blue October light upon the polished boards. Lady Theodosia, without raising her eyes from her embroidery, set one further small, composed stitch. Lord Jasper's fair, fresh complexion went one shade darker. He attempted, with the last bluff of a man who has rehearsed a second errand against the failure of his first, to mention an old debt, a private matter, he said, between fathers, an obligation of the late 4th Duke to the late Earl of Fenwick, dating from the year 99, kept among the Fenwick private papers these 19 years. Mr. Greenway, without rising, opened a small folder at his right hand. My lord, the said debt does not exist. The late 4th Duke of Tarrington passed the year 1799 at Naples, with his physician, for the treatment of his rheumatic gout. The dates and bills of his journey are entered in the late Duke's own travelling journal, kept in this house and produced from the library shelves not 3 feet from my left hand, should your Lordship wish to consult them. The late Duke was demonstrably out of England from the 2nd of May to the 14th of November of that year, during which period he had no transactions of any kind with the Fenwick estate. The matter is closed by the paper. The bluff went down with a small sound, as of a card collapsing on a baize table. Gideon, who had not spoken throughout the whole of Mr. Greenway's address, set the release deed and the August letter and the small folder squarely together at his right hand, laid the heavy silver Tarrington signet upon them for an instant, and lifted his eyes to Lord Jasper. He spoke in the deep, clear baritone he had not raised once in the room. Sir, you are at this moment proposing to me in my own library, in front of my affianced wife, my sister, my solicitor, and my parish vicar, that I pay you £10,000 for your silence regarding a deed lawfully released 6 months ago, and a wedding to be lawfully solemnized in 3 weeks. You will leave Tarrington by 12:30. You will not write to me, to my wife, to her family, or to any other party connected with this matter in any year of your remaining life. Should you write, your letters will be returned to Mr. Greenway. Should you speak of the matter in any London room, the libel suit will be lodged in Lincoln's Inn within 7 days. Should you appear at Tarrington Court, or at any public room where I or my wife are present, you will be removed by my steward and the second footman, and the matter laid before the magistrates. We are agreed. Lord Jasper had gone, by the close of the speech, perfectly white. He did not answer aloud. He inclined his head once. He gathered his portfolio, which now contained nothing of any value to any man. He bowed stiffly to Lady Rosamond, who did not look at him. She was still looking, with her composed, clear, sea-grey gaze, at the leaded window. He bowed to Gideon. Gideon returned the smallest possible inclination of the head. Lord Jasper passed out of the long library at 12 o'clock, and was at the foot of the south portico steps before 12:30. The post-chaise rolled away down the Chestnut Avenue. He never returned to Tarrington Court. By the end of October, he had quietly removed from London to a small Devonshire estate of his wife's family, and he was not heard from in any drawing-room or any London paper in any year of his remaining life. The library, when he had gone, settled. Mr. Greenway gathered his papers. The Reverend Obadiah Marsden removed his small gold-rimmed spectacles, polished them once upon a clean white handkerchief, replaced them, and observed, with the dry humour of a parish vicar of 51, "Your Grace, I have had the privilege, this morning, of seeing the law remember its proper purpose." Lady Theodosia laid down her embroidery upon her knee. She laughed once, a brief, warm, low laugh of a soldier's widow who recognised, in the morning's quiet rout, the small, precise discipline of a campaign well fought. She took up her embroidery again. Gideon crossed the long library to the leaded window. Rosamond had risen from the rosewood table. She stood by the cool, pale square of October light, her hands quietly clasped before her. He took her ungloved right hand in his own and held it, simply, for the better part of half a minute. "Rosamond, 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Gideon." He laid her hand back at her side. There was nothing further to be said. The remainder of the day passed in the small quiet of a household which had cleared its last paper business. Mr. Greenway dined again at Tarrington that evening, and returned to London upon the Saturday post-chaise. Reverend Marsden walked back to the vicarage at 4. The deed of November 1814 was not spoken of again at Tarrington Court that month. Upon Thursday, the 22nd of October, in the late afternoon, the Tarrington travelling carriage came up the Chestnut Avenue from Norfolk. It had been the warmest of the Tarrington carriages, lined upon Mr. Whitlock's instruction with extra blankets and with hot bricks set under the feet, the team chosen for their easy pace. Lady Millicent Westbury had not been out of Westbury Hall in 14 months. She came down at the south portico, very carefully upon her son Anselm's arm, in her dove-grey silk and her white lace cap with the pale pink ribbon. The anxious, pale blue eyes, a little tired with the journey but perfectly composed, and Rosamond came down the steps in her plain dark blue, and Theodosia in her lavender silk, and Mrs. Hemsworth was at the door, and Gideon stood quietly behind, and they brought Lady Millicent into the warm yellow firelight of the great hall, and up by the small back staircase to the yellow suite next to Theodosia's, where Mrs. Hemsworth had been since the night before, with warming pans and a small tray of beef tea. She was settled before 5. Rosamond sat with her until 8. Through the 4 mornings between the 22nd and the 26th, Rosamond visited her mother in the yellow suite each forenoon between 10 and noon. They spoke of small things, of the wedding clothes, of the late chrysanthemums in the great hall, of Reverend Marsden's promised 3-minute address. Lady Millicent gathered her small strength quietly to her, in the careful manner of a woman who had spent 4 years in private dread and was being given in the cool October light of the Wolds the first of her good days. On the evening of Saturday, the 24th of October, 3 days before the wedding, Rosamond came up in her pale rose-pink muslin morning gown after dinner to the yellow suite, where Lady Millicent sat by the fire in her plain dove-grey silk. a small volume of Cowper open upon her knee. They spoke quietly of the wedding clothes laid out in the blue guest chamber, of the church of St. Stephen's and its narrow lancet windows, of Reverend Marsden's gentle voice, of the late 4th Duke of Tarrington, who would have been pleased to see this morning, of Lady Arabella Westbury, Rosamond's grandmother, dead in the year 13, who would have been pleased to see it too. Lady Millicent reached up once, with a hand grown thin in her long indoor years, and kissed her daughter once upon the brow, very gently, without speech. They read together for an hour, Turn and Turn About, from Cowper. At 10 o'clock, Rosamond kissed her mother's cheek, drew the dove-grey shawl closer about her mother's shoulders, and left her to Mrs. Proctor, who would sit with her until she slept. Rosamond went back along the corridor to her own chamber. The blue guest chamber lay quiet beneath its soft blue silk hangings. The candle on the writing desk was burning low. The cool October moon laid a long pale square through the leaded panes upon the polished boards. Rosamond, 20 years of age, 3 days before her wedding, in pale rose-pink muslin still, crossed quietly to the writing desk and drew the small green-bound journal towards her. She turned past the entry of the 1st of June from Cavendish Square and past the single line of the 24th of September. She turned to the first clean leaf. She took up her quill. In her clear, even hand, with no flourish, she wrote, Tarrington, the 24th of October, 1818. 3 days. The deed of November 1814 has not been mentioned in this house in 8 weeks. The deed of October 1818 will be sworn upon a single ring at the altar of St. Stephen's on Tuesday morning at 10. I am not the woman of November 1814. I am the woman of April 1818, which is the woman who has chosen. Ah! She blotted it. She closed the journal. She set the quill in its tray. She blew out the candle. The cool October moon lay long across the polished boards of the blue guest chamber, and Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, 20 years of age, 4 nights from her wedding morning at St. Stephen's, the long quiet weeks of October behind her, and the cold pale blue Lincolnshire morning of the 27th before her, went, composedly, to bed. The morning of Tuesday, the 27th of October, in the year 1818, came up over the high Lincolnshire walls in a cold pale blue late October sky, with the first hard frost of the autumn lying thin and silver upon the grass of the deer park, and with the chestnut avenue at Tarrington Court at full and final turn, gold and bronze, and the deep amber that the Lincolnshire chestnuts kept only for the last week of October before the leaves came down. The cold gold light lay long and even upon the pale Lincolnshire limestone of the Palladian front. The air, in the avenue, was so still that one could hear the rooks 1/2 mile off in the home wood. Tarrington Court itself had been awake since 6. Mrs. Bertha Hemsworth, the housekeeper, in her cleanest black bombazine with the silver chatelaine, had had every fire lit by the half hour and every floor scrubbed by the 3/4. By 7 the kitchen had its goose upon the spit, 2 saddles of mutton in the cold larder, 3 game pies cooling on the long deal board, 4 loaves drawn from the bread oven, 8 Lincolnshire cheeses, 6 bottles of port decanted, and 4 bottles of the late 4th Duke's 1809 claret breathing quietly beside them. The great hall had been decked since the Sunday. Swags of dark green ivy twined through with posies of late chrysanthemums, cream and palest pink, at every cornice, and a tall pyramid of chrysanthemums in the centre of the long oak refectory table that would within 4 hours seat 50 couples. Mr. Silas Whitlock, the steward, 53 years of age, in his best dark brown wool country coat and buff waistcoat and brown leather gaiters, was at the south portico at 7:30, taking the morning's accounts of fires and provisions, and gave Mrs. Hemsworth, when she came past upon her brisk small errand, one quiet square nod that meant the house was, in his judgment of 25 years' service, ready. In the blue guest chamber on the first floor, overlooking the walled rose garden where the last roses of the year hung black upon the wires, Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury woke at 20 minutes to 7, lay for 2 minutes very still beneath the soft blue silk hangings, and then rose with the quiet composure of a young woman who had spent 6 months coming, by her own slow, steady reckoning, to this morning. She drank the small cup of weak tea Mrs. Proctor brought up at 7. She submitted herself at 7:30 to the careful hands of Mrs. Proctor and the lady's maid. By 9:30, when the bells of St. Stephen's, Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, began their first long peal, half a mile away across the village rooftops, carrying clean and silver upon the cold, still Lincolnshire air, Lady Rosamond stood composedly before the cheval glass in the blue guest chamber. The wedding gown was high-waisted ivory silk, with short puff sleeves, plain in cut, with a single narrow row of antique seed pearls embroidered at the hem in the old Westbury manner. Plain white silk gloves came to the elbow. Her mother's small seed pearl earrings sat at her ears. A single strand of seed pearls lay at her throat, and beneath the ivory bodice, against the warm skin, hung the small silver locket on its black silk cord, which she had not been parted from in any morning of any week of any month of the 6 between April and October. Her strawberry blonde hair had been drawn back into a smooth, low chignon and fall down the back, the soft, warm gold catching the small wisps of copper rose where the cool October light came through the leaded panes. Upon the chignon, Mrs. Proctor had pinned a small coronet of late chrysanthemums, cream and palest pink, twined with dark green ivy from the home wood. Lady Theodosia Tarrington-Cove came in at 20 minutes to 10 in her lavender silk, half-mourning, the chestnut-brown coronet smooth beneath the small grey lace widow's cap, the warm grey-green eyes very like her brother's, the small jet brooch at her throat. She carried the Tarrington blonde lace veil of 1782, fine and pale and yellowed only at the deepest edge, folded carefully across both palms. She set it across Rosamond's strawberry blonde hair, pinned it deftly to the coronet of chrysanthemum and ivy in 3 small steady motions, stepped back half a pace, and considered her with the steady, warm, grey-green eyes of a woman who had buried her own husband 6 years before at Salamanca. Theodosia said, very quietly, "My dear, you will do." Mrs. Proctor, standing by the door, made one small, steady nod. Rosamond inclined her head 1/4 inch and gave them both her gloved hand for the briefest moment. At 9:45, the small procession came down the wide grand staircase into the great hall, Rosamond first, on the arm of her brother Anselm, Viscount Westbury, 26 years of age, in a plain dark green country coat over a buff waistcoat and pale buckskins, the strawberry blonde hair fashionably cut, the sea-grey eyes, so like his sister's, gone gravely steady for the morning's office. Behind them came Lady Theodosia in lavender silk. Behind Theodosia came Mrs. Winifred Proctor in her best black bombazine with the small jet brooch. Mrs. Hemsworth, at the foot of the grand staircase, bent her iron-grey head once as the bride passed. The Tarrington carriage stood at the south portico with the 4 greys put to. Anselm handed his sister into the carriage. Theodosia and Mrs. Proctor took their seats opposite, and the 4 greys moved off at a steady walk down the long avenue of bare oaks beyond the chestnut turn. For it was the very end of October, and the leaves of the oaks had nearly all gone, lying in long crisp drifts at the verges. The first hard frost of the morning crackled faintly under the wheels. St. Stephen's, Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, was a small 12th century Lincolnshire stone parish church set on a low rise above the village, with a square Norman tower that had stood 700 years against the Lincolnshire weather. The narrow lancet windows admitted that morning the cool, pale blue October light in long, even shafts upon the plain oak pews polished by 7 centuries of parishioners. At each pew end, Mrs. Hemsworth's nieces had tied, the day before, a small posy of late chrysanthemums, cream and palest pink, twined with dark green ivy, fastened with a length of white silk ribbon. Upon the simple oak altar, 2 tall brass candlesticks bore lit beeswax candles whose warm gold flame stood very still in the cool blue air. The Tarrington tenants and the parish villagers, in their cleanest Sunday black and grey, filled the nave to the doors and stood 3 deep at the porch. The bells of St. Stephen's, which had begun at 9:30, rang on. At the altar, Reverend Obadiah Marsden, 51 years of age, in white linen surplice over black cassock, with the white collar band and the small silver crucifix on a black silk cord, stood with the Book of Common Prayer open upon his 2 long thin hands behind the small gold-rimmed spectacles, the soft silver-grey hair smooth, the kind hazel eyes very steady. Beside him, 3 steps down upon the chancel floor, stood Gideon Henry Tarrington, 5th Duke of Tarrington, 31 years of age. He wore the black, superfine evening tailcoat, the high white starched cravat, the white silk waistcoat with very faint gold pinstripe, black satin knee breeches, white silk stockings, buckled black evening shoes polished to a deep clean lustre. Upon the 3rd finger of his right hand sat the heavy silver Tarrington ducal signet, the stag's head over a pale azure. Upon the smallest finger of his left hand sat his late father's small mourning ring, a thin gold band with a single onyx stone, which Gideon had worn since the September of 1815. At his lapel he had pinned a single sprig of late chrysanthemum, cream, that Theodosia had cut for him at 9:20. The thick, dark russet-brown hair was brushed close at the nape, the faint silver only at the right temple, and the deep grey-green eyes were fixed quietly upon the west door of the nave. At 10 o'clock, by the church clock above the porch, the west door was opened, and the small Lincolnshire choir in the gallery, 8 voices, 4 men and 4 boys from the village, gave out the opening of the Old Plain processional. The villagers turned in the pews. Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury came up the long aisle of St. Stephen's on her brother Anselm's arm, in her ivory silk and her seed pearls and her small coronet of cream chrysanthemum and dark green ivy, the heirloom Tarrington blonde lace veil falling very softly down her back over the chignon and fall of strawberry blonde, her clear sea-grey eyes very steady. Lady Theodosia walked behind her in lavender silk. Mrs. Proctor walked behind Theodosia in best black bombazine. In the foremost pew on the left stood Lord Lionel Westbury, 6th Earl of Westbury, in a dark blue morning coat and dove-grey waistcoat, the thinning silver-grey head bowed, and beside him, very pale and very quiet, but upright, in dove-grey silk, with a white lace cap and the pale pink ribbon, sat Lady Millicent Westbury, who in 14 months had not been out of Westbury Hall before this October, and who watched her daughter come up the aisle with the anxious pale blue eyes gone, for the first time in 4 years, quite still. At the altar, Anselm gave his sister's hand into Reverend Marsden's, who placed it into Gideon's. The cool, pale blue October light came in long, even shafts through the lancet windows. The warm gold of the 2 beeswax candles upon the altar stood very steady in the cool blue. Reverend Marsden read, in his gentle, clear voice, the long opening of the marriage service from the Book of Common Prayer, the dearly beloved, the causes for which matrimony was ordained, the charge to declare any cause why these 2 might not lawfully be joined together. The cool blue silence held. He turned to the man and put the question plainly. Gideon Tarrington's deep, clear baritone, plain and unhurried, gave back the answer in 5 words. "I will, and most freely." Reverend Marsden turned to the woman and put the question to her. Lady Rosamond's soft, warm contralto, with the faint Norfolk borders softening at the vowel, gave back the 2 clear words of the office. "I will." The plain gold ring, a Tarrington heirloom of more than 100 years' standing, taken that morning by Gideon from the small, velvet-lined leather box that had held it through 3 previous Tarrington weddings, was laid upon the open Book of Common Prayer, blessed, taken up, and placed by Gideon upon the 3rd finger of Rosamond's white, silk-gloved left hand. The vows were spoken in their proper order, in the proper words, with a quiet steadiness on each side that the parish villagers would speak of, in the kitchens and at the firesides of the parish, for many years afterwards. The ring sat plain and warm upon the white silk. When the office was done, Reverend Marsden led the small bridal party to the vestry. There, upon the parish register laid open upon the long oak vestry table, in the clear, small, even hand she had been taught at 16 by Mrs. Proctor, Rosamond signed in full, Rosamond Charlotte Westbury Tarrington. Beside her name, in the firm, clean hand that her husband's was, Gideon signed, Gideon Henry Tarrington. The ink was blotted. Anselm signed, Theodosia signed, Lord Westbury signed with a hand that shook only in the last letter and then steadied. Reverend Marsden countersigned as officiant. They returned to the chancel. Reverend Marsden, in his white linen surplice and his black cassock, with the small silver crucifix, opened his hands very simply and gave the parish the short 3-minute address he had told Gideon a fortnight before he intended to give. He named, simply in the gravity of the parish, with no flourish, the persons of the day. He said, in his gentle, clear voice, "Father of all mercies, we thank thee for this bread, this wine, this fire, this roof, and these good friends. We thank thee particularly for the late 4th Duke of Tarrington, 1750 to 1815, and the late Duchess Lady Augusta, 1758 to 1798, who would have been pleased to see this morning. For Lady Ophelia Ayres, 1789 to 1814, whose long, quiet 8 years past has not been forgotten. For Lord Lionel and Lady Millicent Westbury, present at this altar. For the late Lady Arabella Westbury, 1735 to 1813, and for the Lady Rosamond Charlotte Westbury, who has, this morning, of her own clear sea-grey 20-year-old courage, become Duchess of Tarrington. We commend her and her husband and the years that lie before them to thy keeping, and we send ourselves out into the morning with thankful hearts. Amen. He did not name Lord Jasper Fenwick. The cool blue light through the lancets stood quiet upon the plain oak pews. The small Lincolnshire choir in the gallery gave out the recessional. Gideon Tarrington and his Duchess walked down the long aisle of St. Stephen's on each other's arm, past the parish villagers in their cleanest Sunday black, past Mrs. Hemsworth at the back of the nave, who had slipped in for the last 5 minutes, and out under the small Norman porch into the cold, pale blue Lincolnshire morning. The bells of St. Stephen's, which had rung at 9:30, rang on. They rang for half an hour, above the cold gold wolds. The whole village stood at the church path and at the lych gate, and as the Tarrington carriage rolled out from the porch and turned along the village street and back towards the long avenue, the parish threw chrysanthemum petals, cream and palest pink, in soft handfuls across the carriage and across the cold pale gravel, so that the 4 greys went up the long avenue of bare oaks beneath a slow drift of pale petals upon the cold gold morning. The wedding breakfast in the great hall at Tarrington Court was set for 50 couples. 5 removes, the soup, the fish, the goose with the saddles of mutton, the game pies with the cold cuts, the puddings and the cheeses, with port at every gentleman's elbow, and the late 4th Duke's 1809 claret upon the centre. The small Lincolnshire choir had been brought up from St. Stephen's to the gallery, and they gave the company 4 old border country airs and 1 quiet old border lament that Lady Arabella Westbury had been fond of, which Rosamond had asked the choirmaster to include. Mrs. Proctor sat at the bride's left hand, Reverend Marsden at the groom's right, Lord Lionel at his daughter's right, Lady Millicent composedly at the foot of the table in her dove-grey silk, the anxious pale blue eyes warmed by firelight and beeswax candle. Anselm sat opposite Lady Theodosia. Mr. Whitlock had a place at the lower end, and conducted himself there with the quiet pleasure of a man of 25 years' service. Mr. Greenway, down from Lincoln's Inn in plain black superfine, sat near him with a small private smile that he did not all morning entirely lose. The 5 removes went their proper courses. The old border lament Lady Arabella had been fond of went very quiet through the high beams, and Lady Millicent at the foot of the table touched the corner of her eye once with the edge of her lace handkerchief. Lord Westbury rose and gave a short, steady toast to his daughter and her husband in 8 clear sentences he had written out the night before. Gideon rose to answer in 7 sentences of his own, plain, unhurried, and named the late 4th Duke, Lady Augusta, Lady Ophelia, the parish of Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, Lady Arabella Westbury, and his new wife, in the proper order. Reverend Marsden gave the closing grace. The company drank to the bride. The afternoon went quietly into the cool gold of late October dusk. Lady Millicent was carried up to the Yellow Suite at 7 and slept in her chair by her fire before 9. Lord Westbury sat long with Mr. Greenway at the great hall fire. Theodosia and Mrs. Proctor saw the last country couples to their carriages at 11:30. Reverend Marsden was conveyed to the vicarage at midnight. The underfootmen began quietly to clear. It was past midnight when Gideon and his wife stepped out by the small east door into the moonlit walled rose garden. He had changed into a plain dark green country coat. She had laid her cream cashmere shawl over the wedding silk above the seed pearls. The cold gold Lincolnshire moon stood high above the south wall. The first hard frost was on the gravel. They walked together along the gravel path between the late roses and the dark box edging. The cold still air smelled of the homewood beyond the wall. Their breath went pale before them. There was no sound but the small crisp report of the frost beneath their shoes. He stopped at the small marble bench in the south corner. He turned to her in the cold gold moon. He stood half a pace from her, with the deep grey-green eyes very steady, and the deep clear baritone gone unhurried and quiet. He said, "Rosamond Charlotte Westbury Tarrington, Duchess of Tarrington, my dear wife, I came to Westbury on the 28th of April upon my conscience. I leave this autumn evening upon yours. I have, in 6 months, learned to be the man I should have been to a 16-year-old 4 years ago, and have been spared, by the courage of a 20-year-old this April, the necessity of releasing what I had not deserved to be given. I am in your debt for the marriage I did not earn, and was given all the same, one cold, pale blue April morning at 20 minutes past 6. She let the words stand a long moment in the cold gold moon. The sea-grey eyes held his with the quiet steadiness that had not, from the small east drawing-room of Westbury Hall on the 28th of April, through the season at Cavendish Square, through the orangery at Tarrington in late September, through the library on the 9th of October, to this midnight rose garden, ever once altered. She said very simply, in the soft, warm contralto, "Gideon, I shall not answer that this evening. I shall answer it every morning for a great many years." He took her ungloved hand into his own gloved hand. He did not kiss it. He held it a long minute in the cold gold Lincolnshire moon. Their breath stood pale together upon the cold air. the first hard October frost crisped faintly at their feet on the gravel. Then he drew her hand quietly upon his arm, in the steady old country gentleman manner with which he had handed her into 100 carriages in 6 months, and they walked back across the rose garden gravel along the box edging towards the lit east windows of Tarrington Court. The warm beeswax candle gold of the small east hall stood quiet and yellow against the cold pale blue dark. At 1:15 in the morning, the last under-footman, who had waited at his post in the small east hall for the master and the new mistress to come in from the rose garden, drew the small east door to behind them, set the bolt across very softly, and shut out the cold gold Lincolnshire moon and the first hard frost of the autumn night. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with what is not there. And there are, rarer, harder, more dignified stories that begin with a single sharp knock at 6 on a cold, pale blue Norfolk morning, when a 31-year-old duke who had spent 8 days riding north from Lincolnshire to do the right thing arrived at the front door of a girl he had not been able to release in his own conscience. He came to set her free. She, in 9 sentences of her own composing, refused to be set free without choosing it. And so, he did the second of the 2 right things. He gave her 3 months of London by which to make her choice, and a September at Tarrington by which to confirm it, and a wedding at Tarrington-on-the-Wolds in the last week of October by which to close it. The deed of November 1814 had been signed by a 16-year-old who had not been free to refuse it. The vow of October 1818 was made by a 20-year-old who had been given every means to refuse it, and who had chosen, in her own clear sea-grey morning composure, not to. And so, on a cold, pale blue Lincolnshire morning of the 27th of October, in the year 1818, 6 months and a day after a 31-year-old duke had ridden out of a Norfolk avenue at 8:30 without the bride he had come to release, the bells of St. Stephen's, Tarrington-on-the-Wolds, rang half an hour above the cold gold wolds, and the long quiet of one honourable conscience and one composed 20-year-old courage met at last under one Lincolnshire altar, and the marriage that had been promised by a deed in November 1814 became, at last and for good, a marriage made by the woman herself in October 1818,